It began the night the sky opened like a wound. Marcus Webb had been fixing engines in the same small-town garage for 17 years, and in all that time, he'd learned to trust what his hands could touch and what his eyes could see. Metal, oil, the predictable rhythm of pistons and crankshafts. The world made sense when you could take it apart and put it back together, when you could diagnose a problem and solve it with wrenches and patience. But on that October night, standing in the gravel parking lot of his garage outside of Odessa, Texas, watching something impossible unfold in the sky above the Morrison farm, Marcus learned that some things couldn't be fixed with tools. Some things couldn't be explained by the laws of physics he thought he understood. The Morrisons were good people. Dale and Rebecca, married 23 years, with 3 kids. Emma, 12, and the twins, Jake and Joshua, 8. They attended First Baptist every Sunday, bought their groceries at the same store as everyone else, lived quiet lives in a white farmhouse 3 miles outside town. Marcus had gone to school with Dale, had fixed his truck more times than he could count. Normal people, salt of the earth, which made what happened to them all the more terrifying. Marcus had been working late, trying to finish a transmission rebuild before the weekend, when he stepped outside for air around 11 p.m. The October night was cool and clear, the kind of night where the stars seemed close enough to touch. He lit a cigarette, a habit he'd been trying to quit since his wife left him 5 years ago, and looked up at the sky out of habit more than interest. That's when he saw the light over the Morrison farm. At first he thought it was a helicopter, some kind of searchlight, maybe law enforcement looking for someone. But the light was wrong, too bright, too focused. It came straight down from the sky like a pillar, connecting heaven and earth, bathing the Morrison property in blue-white radiance that made the darkness around it seem absolute by comparison. Marcus dropped his cigarette. His heart kicked into a higher gear. Something about that light triggered a primal response, something older than reason. His body knew, even if his mind didn't want to accept it, that he was seeing something he wasn't supposed to see. He got in his truck without thinking, driving toward the Morrison place on instinct. The road was empty, the fields on either side dark and silent. As he got closer, the light grew more intense, and he could see shapes moving within it. Not mechanical shapes, living shapes. Marcus pulled off the road about a quarter-mile from the farm, killed his engine and lights, and got out. He moved through the darkness at the edge of the field, staying low, driven by a need to understand what he was witnessing. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to turn around, to drive back to town, to call the sheriff. But another part, deeper, older, compelled him forward. From the cover of a line of cottonwood trees, he could see the Morrison house clearly. The beam of light came from something hovering above the property. A craft, though that word felt inadequate. It was massive, silent, and shaped like nothing Marcus had ever seen. Not a disc, not a triangle, but something that seemed to shift between geometries, like his eyes couldn't quite lock onto its true form. And beneath it, in the yard, the Morrison family stood together. They weren't screaming, they weren't running. They stood in a tight cluster, Dale with his arms around Rebecca, the kids pressed against their parents, and they were all looking up at the light. Marcus couldn't see their faces from this distance, but he could sense their terror in the way they held each other, in the rigid set of their shoulders. Figures descended from the light, tall, impossibly tall, moving with a grace that didn't quite match human locomotion. Marcus counted 4 of them, and as they approached the family, Rebecca dropped to her knees. Dale was saying something. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but he could see Dale's mouth moving, see the desperation in his gestures. One of the beings reached out toward Emma, and that's when Marcus heard it. A voice, not spoken aloud, but somehow present in his mind, resonating in his chest, vibrating in his bones. It spoke in a language he didn't know, yet somehow understood. The meaning bypassed language entirely and landed directly in his consciousness. They are marked for examination. We require data. Your interference will be noted and corrected. Marcus felt his body go cold. These beings, whatever they were, spoke with absolute authority, as if humans were specimens, subjects, things to be studied rather than people to be respected. There was no malice in the voice, but no compassion either, just cold, clinical detachment. He watched Dale step forward, placing himself between the beings and his family. Even from a distance, Marcus could see him trembling, but Dale didn't back down. He was protecting his family the only way he knew how, with his body, with his will, with whatever courage he could summon. And then Dale did something Marcus would never forget. He started to pray, not quietly, not with his head bowed. He lifted his face toward those beings and spoke words that carried across the field, words that Marcus could hear even from his hiding place. The prayer wasn't eloquent. It wasn't the kind of prayer you'd hear in church, carefully crafted and theologically sound. It was desperate and raw and real. Dale called on Jesus, not as a concept, not as a historical figure, but as a living presence. He called for protection. He called for deliverance. He called with the voice of a father who would do anything to save his children. And something changed. The beings stopped advancing. One of them, the closest to Dale, tilted its head, as if listening to something. The light from the craft above began to flicker, and Marcus heard that voice again in his mind. But this time it sounded different, uncertain, almost confused. This one carries a frequency that contradicts our parameters. This one broadcasts a signal we cannot override. Dale kept praying, his voice growing stronger, and Rebecca joined him. Then the kids. 4 voices lifted in desperation and faith, calling on a name that had been spoken for 2,000 years, asking for mercy from a source these beings apparently recognized. The air around the Morrison family began to shimmer, not with the same cold blue-white of the craft's light, but with something else, something warm, golden. It formed a barrier around them, subtle but unmistakable, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. The beings retreated, not quickly but deliberately, moving back toward the beam of light. Marcus heard that voice one more time, and now there was something new in it. Not fear exactly, but recognition, acknowledgement. The protection is active. The ancient covenant remains in force. We withdraw. The figures ascended into the light and the craft began to rise. The beam cut off abruptly, plunging the Morrison property into darkness. For a moment, Marcus couldn't see anything, his eyes struggling to adjust after the intense brightness. When his vision cleared, he saw the Morrison family still standing together in their yard, holding each other, illuminated only by the porch light and the stars above. The craft was gone. The sky was empty. It was as if nothing had happened, except for the Morrison family's ragged breathing and the way they clung to each other like shipwreck survivors. Marcus stood frozen behind the cottonwoods, his mind trying to process what he'd witnessed. Beings from somewhere, a family nearly taken. A prayer that somehow stopped it, protection that manifested as visible light, an ancient covenant. He waited until the Morrisons went back inside their house, waited until the lights came on in the windows, waited until his legs stopped shaking enough to carry him back to his truck. He drove home in silence, not trusting himself to think, not trusting the world to make sense anymore. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in his small apartment above the garage, staring at the wall, replaying what he'd seen over and over. By morning, he'd almost convinced himself it was a hallucination. Stress, too many late nights, something in the air. But when he went to work the next day, Dale Morrison was there, standing next to his truck in the parking lot. The man looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands shaking as he held a cup of coffee. "Marcus," Dale said quietly, "we need to talk." They sat in Marcus's office, a cramped space filled with parts, catalogs, and invoices. Dale stared at his coffee for a long time before speaking. "You were there last night. I know you were. I felt someone watching." Marcus started to deny it, but the words died in his throat. What was the point? They both knew what had happened. They both knew the world was different now than it had been yesterday. What were they? Marcus asked. Dale shook his head slowly. "I don't know what to call them. Angels, demons, aliens. The words don't fit. But I know what they wanted. They wanted my family. They wanted to take us somewhere, do something to us. And I know what stopped them. The prayer. Not just the prayer, the name. When I called on Jesus, when I really meant it, when I put everything I had into it, something happened. Something protected us. I felt it, Marcus, like a wall of light between us and them. They couldn't cross it. They tried, but they couldn't." Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing. "You saying Jesus is some kind of, what, force field?" Dale's laugh was bitter. "I'm saying I've been going to church my whole life, and I thought I knew what faith meant. I thought it was about believing the right things, saying the right words, being a good person. But last night taught me different. Faith isn't intellectual. It's not agreeing with a set of ideas. It's a connection, a frequency, like those things said. And when you tap into it, really tap into it, it has power, real power, the kind that can stand between you and things that want to harm you." Over the following days, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about what Dale had said. He'd been raised Baptist, gone to church as a kid, but had drifted away in his 20s. After his wife left, he'd stopped thinking about God entirely. What was the point? The universe was random. Bad things happened. You dealt with it or you didn't. Faith was just a comfort blanket for people who couldn't handle reality. But he'd seen something that night. Something that challenged every assumption he'd built his life on. Those beings had been real. Their power had been real. And the protection that rose around the Morrison family, that had been real too. Marcus started researching. Late at night, after the garage closed, he'd sit at his computer diving into rabbit holes he'd never imagined existed. UFO encounters, alien abductions, but he filtered specifically for cases involving faith, prayer, religious protection. And what he found disturbed him deeply. There were patterns. Hundreds of documented cases where people claimed that invoking the name of Jesus stopped abduction experiences. Testimonies from people all over the world, from different denominations, different cultures, all saying the same thing. When they called on Jesus, the beings left. The paralysis ended. The fear lifted. The encounters stopped. Skeptics dismissed it as psychological. True believers claimed it as proof of demonic activity. But Marcus began to see something else. A possibility that both explanations missed. What if these beings, whatever they were, operated on rules, ancient rules, cosmic laws that predated human civilization? What if the name of Jesus wasn't magic, but rather a key that unlocked a protection written into the fabric of reality itself? What if Earth, humanity, had been placed under a specific covenant, and these beings, despite their technology and power, had to respect it? The more Marcus read, the more the pieces fell into place. Biblical stories of angels and demons took on new dimensions. The book of Revelation's talk of cosmic warfare suddenly sounded less metaphorical and more like a description of forces humanity was only beginning to understand. Jacob wrestling with an angel, Ezekiel's wheel, the Star of Bethlehem, Moses and the burning bush. What if it had all been real? What if the ancients had been describing encounters with non-human intelligences, using the language and concepts they had available? And what if Jesus, the historical Jesus, had done something, established something, that created a protective barrier around those who invoked his authority? Marcus started attending church again. Not First Baptist, where Dale went. That felt too public, too exposed. He found a small non-denominational church on the edge of town, 30 people at most, led by a pastor named Coleman, who was more interested in questions than answers. After a service one Sunday, Marcus approached Pastor Coleman. The man was in his 60s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that suggested he'd worked hard labor before finding his calling. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said. "About spiritual warfare," Coleman smiled. "Most people want to talk about spiritual comfort. Warfare is a harder sell. Come on, let's walk." They walked through the small cemetery behind the church, past weathered headstones marking generations of the faithful. Marcus told him everything: the Morrison encounter, the research, the questions that kept him awake at night. Coleman listened without interruption, his face grave. When Marcus finished, the pastor stopped walking and looked up at the sky. "The modern church doesn't like to talk about this," Coleman said. "We've sanitized everything, made it all about personal salvation and moral behavior, but the early Christians understood something we've forgotten, that we're living in a contested space, that Earth is a battleground in a conflict most people can't see." "You believe in aliens?" Marcus asked. "I believe in non-human intelligences. I believe the universe is more populated and more complex than we can imagine. And I believe that humans are special, not because we're superior, but because we're under protection. The incarnation wasn't just about forgiveness of sins, Marcus. It was about establishing sovereignty. When Christ took on human flesh, lived as one of us, died and rose again, he claimed authority over this realm, over us. And that authority is recognized by powers we can't see." Coleman pulled a worn Bible from his jacket pocket. Ephesians 6:12. "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." Paul wasn't being poetic. He was describing reality. There are forces out there, intelligences, beings, powers, and they have agendas. But they operate under rules, and one of those rules is that humans who claim Christ's protection are off limits. "Why doesn't everyone know this?" Marcus asked. "Why isn't the church talking about it?" Fear. ignorance, denominational politics, take your pick, but mostly because it's easier to talk about theology than to confront the reality of spiritual warfare. It's easier to debate doctrines than to acknowledge that we're living in a cosmos where our souls are contested territory. Marcus went home that day with more questions than answers, but also with a strange sense of clarity. He'd been looking for mechanical explanations, what those beings were, where they came from, what technology they used, but maybe he'd been asking the wrong questions. Maybe the real question wasn't what they were, but what protected humanity from them. And maybe the answer was simpler and more profound than he'd imagined. 3 weeks after the Morrison incident, Marcus had another encounter, not with the beings, but with something that confirmed everything he'd been learning. He was closing up the garage late one evening when a car pulled into the lot. An old Buick, rust-spotted and wheezing. A woman got out, mid-40s, blonde hair pulled back, eyes that looked haunted. She approached Marcus with hesitant steps. "Are you Marcus Webb?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Christine Palmer. Dale Morrison gave me your name. Said you might understand." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "Understand what?" Christine looked around as if checking to make sure they were alone. "I was taken 3 months ago. They did things to me. Examinations. I can't remember all of it, but I have marks, and I have nightmares, and I know it was real. I went to doctors. They think I'm crazy. I went to my pastor. He prayed for me, but didn't really believe me. Dale said you saw what happened to his family. Said you might know what I can do to make it stop." Marcus invited her into the office, made coffee, and listened. Christine's story poured out. The paralysis, the bright lights, the beings with their 2 large eyes and clinical detachment. She'd been taken multiple times, she said. Always at night. Always when she was alone. She'd wake up with missing time and marks on her skin that looked like surgical incisions. "Last time," she said, her voice shaking, "I tried praying, like Dale told me to. I called on Jesus, and—" She stopped, tears streaming down her face. "They got angry, Marcus. I could feel their anger, but they stopped. They brought me back to my room and left, and they haven't come back since. But I'm terrified they will. I'm terrified that next time the prayer won't work." Marcus leaned forward. "Why do you think it worked?" "I don't know. I've never been particularly religious. I believe in God, but I don't go to church much. I've never been baptized. I'm not a good Christian. But when I said that name, something happened. Something protected me." "It's not about being good," Marcus said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside him. "It's about the authority you're invoking. Those beings recognize it. They have to. It's not about your faith being perfect or your theology being right. It's about tapping into a protection that's already there, waiting for you to claim it." They talked for 2 hours. Marcus shared everything he'd learned, and Christine listened with the intensity of someone whose survival depended on understanding. When she left, she looked less frightened, still shaken, still marked by her experience, but no longer helpless. Over the following months, Marcus became an unofficial counselor for people like Christine. They found him through word of mouth, abductees, people who'd had encounters, individuals experiencing phenomena they couldn't explain. They came to his garage after dark, seeking not mechanical fixes but spiritual ones, seeking to understand what was happening to them and how to protect themselves. Marcus wasn't a pastor. He wasn't a theologian. He was a mechanic who'd witnessed something impossible and had been changed by it. But somehow that made him the right person for this. He spoke their language. Practical, direct, grounded. He didn't offer platitudes or religious jargon. He offered what he'd learned, that the universe was stranger than anyone admitted, that humanity was caught in forces beyond comprehension, and that there was real protection available for those who knew how to access it. He began to see the bigger picture. These encounters weren't random. They were systematic, targeted, ongoing. The beings, whatever they were, had an agenda involving humanity. Study, observation, perhaps something darker, but they operated under constraints, rules that limited what they could do, especially to those who claimed protection under the ancient covenant. Marcus started documenting everything: cases, patterns, correlations. He filled notebooks with testimonies, observations, questions. He built a network of people who'd had encounters, connecting them, letting them know they weren't alone or crazy. And through it all, he kept coming back to one central truth. The name of Jesus had power. Real, measurable, consistent power. Not because of magic or superstition, but because of something woven into the structure of reality itself. a protection established 2,000 years ago by an event that was far more significant than the church had ever taught. 6 months after the Morrison incident, Marcus sat in his office late one night, staring at pages of notes spread across his desk. The garage was quiet, the town asleep. He'd changed so much in these months. His cynicism had burned away, replaced by something harder to define. Not blind faith, but informed conviction. He'd seen too much to doubt. He'd heard too many testimonies to dismiss. His phone rang. Dale Morrison. "Marcus, you need to come out here. Now." "What's wrong?" "They're back, the lights are back, but this time it's different. This time I'm not afraid." Marcus drove to the Morrison farm faster than he should have, his heart pounding. When he pulled into the driveway, he saw the family standing in their yard, looking up at the sky. The beam of light was there again, descending from the invisible craft above. But Dale was right. Something was different. The family wasn't huddled in fear. They stood with arms raised, speaking words Marcus couldn't quite hear, and around them that golden shimmer was visible again, stronger this time, brighter. The beam of light from above tried to penetrate it, but couldn't. It was like watching water hit an invisible shield and slide away. Marcus got out of his truck and stood at the edge of the yard, watching. This time he wasn't hiding. This time he wasn't afraid. He understood now what he was seeing. The craft above pulsed with light as if frustrated. That voice echoed in Marcus's mind again, the one he'd heard months ago. "You are interfering with designated research protocols. This is a violation of cooperative agreements." But another voice answered, not from the craft, but from everywhere and nowhere. A voice that felt ancient and absolute, carrying weight that made the being's voice seem thin and powerless by comparison. "These are mine, marked by covenant, sealed by sacrifice. You have no authority here." The beam cut off. The craft began to rise, and Marcus could sense something like anger radiating from it, or maybe frustration, or maybe just acknowledgement of a power greater than its own. The Morrison family lowered their arms as the craft disappeared into the night sky. Dale turned and saw Marcus standing there. He walked over, and his face was transformed, no longer fearful, but filled with something like wonder. "Do you see now?" Dale asked. "Do you understand what we're protected by?" Marcus nodded. "I do. I finally do." They stood together in the darkness, watching the stars, knowing that above them, around them, forces were at work that most of humanity couldn't see or imagine, but knowing too that there was protection, real protection, not just philosophical comfort, but actual tangible defense against things that would otherwise have free rein. Marcus drove home that night, feeling like he'd been given a mission he never asked for, but couldn't refuse. He was a mechanic, but he was also a witness, a bridge between the world that denied this reality and the world where it was undeniable. The universe was vast, it was populated, and humanity was more precious, more protected, more central to cosmic events than anyone realized. And at the heart of it all was a name, a person, a sacrifice that had done something the beings with all their technology and power had to respect. Jesus. Not a concept, not a philosophy, but a protection written into the code of reality itself. Marcus had spent his life fixing engines. Now he understood there was something more important to fix. The disconnect between what humanity believed and what was actually true about the cosmos they inhabited. The work was just beginning. The months that followed the second Morrison encounter marked a transformation in Marcus Webb that went beyond understanding. It became embodiment. He no longer simply knew there were forces at work in the cosmos. He lived with that knowledge the way a man lives with his own heartbeat, constant, undeniable, fundamental to his existence. His garage became more than a place where broken engines were repaired. It became a sanctuary for broken people seeking answers to questions the world refused to acknowledge. They came in quietly, usually after dark. A farmer from 3 counties over whose cattle kept disappearing under strange circumstances. A school teacher who woke up with geometric burns on her arms and memories she couldn't quite grasp. A retired Air Force colonel who'd seen things during his service that violated every clearance level he'd ever signed. They came because word spread through underground networks that Marcus Webb was someone who would listen without judgment, who would believe without demanding proof, who had seen what they'd seen and understood what it meant. Marcus never advertised, never sought attention. He simply fixed their cars during the day and listened to their stories at night, offering what he'd learned through experience and research, and increasingly through prayer. Though his prayers looked nothing like what he'd learned as a child in Sunday school, His prayers were raw, direct, sometimes angry. He spoke to God like a mechanic, talks to an engine that's not performing to specs, demanding answers, questioning design choices, but ultimately trusting that there was purpose and intelligence behind the system. And somehow that honesty seemed to create a channel that formal prayers never had. Pastor Coleman became a regular visitor to the garage. The old man would show up with coffee and conversation, and the two would talk late into the night about theology, cosmology, and the intersection of faith with phenomena the church pretended didn't exist. Coleman brought books, old books, some banned, some forgotten, written by mystics and visionaries who'd understood that the spiritual realm was far more populated and complex than modern Christianity admitted. One night, Coleman spread out a collection of ancient texts on Marcus's desk. You know what the early church fathers wrote about? Watchers, principalities, cosmic hierarchies. They understood that the universe was teeming with intelligences and that humans were special not because we were alone, but because we were claimed, marked, protected by a covenant sealed in blood. Marcus studied the texts, writings by Origen, Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius. They spoke of multiple heavens, angelic orders, beings of pure intellect who existed in dimensions humans couldn't perceive. But they also spoke of boundaries, rules, a divine order that even the most powerful entities had to respect. The problem, Coleman continued, is that somewhere along the way, the church decided to stop talking about this. It became easier to focus on personal morality and church attendance than to acknowledge we're living in contested territory. But you've seen it, Marcus. You've witnessed the battle, and you've seen the protection work. Why me? Marcus asked, a question that had haunted him since that first night watching the Morrison encounter. Why did I have to see it? Why not someone more qualified? A theologian, a scientist, someone who could actually do something with the knowledge? Coleman smiled. Because mechanics fix things. You see a problem, you diagnose it, you find a solution. The church has theologians who can debate doctrine for centuries without reaching consensus. Science has researchers who can study phenomena without ever accepting it's real. But you're practical. You see what works. And that's exactly what people need right now. Someone who can tell them, here's what's happening, here's what protects you, here's how to use it. The validation helped, but Marcus still struggled with the weight of what he'd witnessed. Some nights, lying awake in his small apartment, he'd question his own sanity. Maybe he'd had a breakdown. Maybe the divorce, the loneliness, the years of repetitive work had finally cracked something in his mind. Maybe he was leading vulnerable people into delusion. But then someone else would show up with a story that matched the patterns. Another confirmation, another piece of evidence that this was real, that the protection was real, that he wasn't crazy or delusional, but simply awake to aspects of reality most people refuse to see. The breakthrough came on a February night, cold enough that Marcus's breath fogged in the unheated garage. A young woman arrived unannounced, driving a car that was barely running. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with dark circles under her eyes and the jumpiness of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Her name was Rachel, and her story was different from the others. She'd been experiencing encounters since childhood, missing time, strange dreams, memories of examinations. But recently something had changed. The encounters had become more frequent, more aggressive. The beings were no longer content with observation. They wanted something from her specifically, and she could sense their growing frustration when she resisted. I tried what you've been telling people, she said, her voice shaking. I called on Jesus. I prayed, and it worked for a while. They'd back off, leave me alone for a few weeks, but they keep coming back stronger. Like they're testing the boundaries, trying to find a way around the protection. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. When did this start escalating? 2 months ago, right after... She hesitated. Right after I started researching them, trying to understand what they really are. I think I got too close to something they didn't want me to know. What did you find? Rachel pulled out a folder, thick with printed articles and handwritten notes. These beings, whatever we want to call them, they're not all the same. There are different types, different agendas. Some seem genuinely curious about humanity. Others are darker, more predatory. And they all seem to operate under some kind of cosmic hierarchy. Rules they have to follow. But the rules have loopholes. She spread papers across the desk, showing Marcus diagrams, testimonies, patterns she'd identified. Look at this. In every case where the Jesus prayer works, the person is genuinely calling out from a place of faith, not perfect faith, not theological correctness, but authentic connection. When that's present, the beings have to withdraw. But when it's just words without belief, when it's mechanical repetition without real invocation of authority, they can push through. Marcus studied her notes, his mind racing. This aligned with everything he'd observed, but Rachel had systematized it in ways he hadn't considered. You're saying the protection is real, but it requires activation. It's not automatic. Exactly. It's like, imagine a firewall on a computer. It's there, it's protecting you, but if you don't engage it properly, if you leave ports open, if you don't maintain it, threats can get through. The covenant Christ established is real, the protection is real, but it requires participation, belief, claiming it consciously. And these beings know that. Yes, which is why they're getting more strategic. They're targeting people when they're doubtful, when they're isolated, when their faith is weak. They're looking for moments of vulnerability where the protection isn't fully engaged. Marcus leaned back, processing. This was more sophisticated than he'd realized. These beings weren't just physically advanced. They understood human psychology, spirituality, the mechanics of faith itself. They were probing for weaknesses in humanity's collective defense. So what do we do, he asked. We teach people to maintain the connection, not just invoke it in emergencies, but live in it constantly, make it their default state, rather than something they activate when threatened. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Rachel worked together, developing what they started calling spiritual protocols, practical steps that people experiencing encounters could take to strengthen their protection. Prayer, yes, but also visualization techniques, conscious claiming of authority, building and maintaining awareness of the protective covenant rather than just calling on it during crisis. They tested these protocols with the small community of experiencers who'd gathered around Marcus's garage. The results were striking. People who implemented the practices consistently reported that encounters stopped entirely or became far less intrusive. The beings seemed unable or unwilling to engage with individuals who maintained strong, conscious connection to their spiritual protection. But the work came at a cost. Marcus began to notice he was being watched. Nothing overt, no black SUVs or men in suits, but subtle things, cars that seemed to follow him for a few blocks, then disappear. The sense of being observed even when alone. Electronic interference with his phone and computer, his mail going missing. Pastor Coleman warned him that what they were doing, documenting these encounters, teaching people to protect themselves, building a network, would attract attention from multiple sources. Government agencies that monitored UFO activity, intelligence services interested in psychological warfare, and possibly the beings themselves, who might not appreciate humans becoming less vulnerable to their activities. You've become a problem to them, Coleman said one evening. You're teaching people to close the vulnerabilities. You're strengthening the collective defense. That's not something they can ignore. Marcus knew the pastor was right, but he also knew he couldn't stop. Too many people needed this information. Too many lives were being affected by encounters that left them traumatized, confused, isolated. If he could help even a few people understand what was happening and how to protect themselves, the risk was worth it. The confrontation came on a night in early spring, when the air still carried winter's bite but promised warmer days ahead. Marcus was alone in the garage, working late on a diesel engine that refused to cooperate when all the lights went out. Not gradually, instantly. As if someone had thrown a switch, the darkness was absolute. No streetlights visible through the windows, no glow from the town in the distance. Nothing but blackness so complete it felt solid. Marcus stood still, his hands on the engine block, his heart hammering. He knew what this was. He'd heard enough stories to recognize the signs. Time distortion, spatial anomaly, the beginning of contact. "I know you're here," he said into the darkness, his voice steadier than he expected. "Show yourselves." Light bloomed around him, not from any visible source, but emanating from the air itself. And in that light, 3 figures materialized, tall, angular, their forms shifting between solid and translucent, as if his eyes couldn't quite lock onto their true appearance. One of them moved closer, and Marcus heard that voice in his mind, the same mechanical, emotionless tone he'd heard during the Morrison encounters. "Marcus Webb, you have been warned to cease interference with our research protocols. You have been observed sharing information that compromises our activities. This must stop." Marcus felt fear, real, primal fear, that made his legs weak and his hands shake. But underneath it was something else. The warmth he'd felt before, the presence, the protection. He focused on that, letting it fill him, letting it push back against the fear. "Your research," he said, "violates the consent and dignity of human beings. You have no right to take people against their will, to examine them like specimens, to traumatize them. Rights are conditional upon capacity. Your species is categorized as developing, subject to study. These are established protocols." "Established by whom?" Marcus demanded. "Who gave you authority over humanity?" The being tilted its head. "Authority is not given. It is taken. Your species lacks the capacity to defend itself. We operate within permitted boundaries. But there are boundaries, aren't there? Rules you have to follow, a covenant you have to respect." The three beings exchanged what might have been glances. The one closest to Marcus spoke again, and this time Marcus detected something new in the voice. Not quite emotion, but acknowledgement. "The Nazarene established parameters that constrain certain activities. Those who invoke his authority correctly are outside our jurisdiction." "This is accurate. Then why are you here? Why threaten me?" "You are teaching others to invoke this protection. You are systematizing knowledge that should remain fragmented. This reduces available subjects for necessary research. This creates complications." Marcus felt his fear transforming into something else. Anger, righteous anger at the cold calculation behind those words. "Necessary research? You're talking about people, families, children, people who never consented to be your subjects. You call it research, I call it violation." The being moved closer, and Marcus felt pressure building in his head, like invisible hands pressing against his skull. "You will cease these activities. You will disperse your network. You will stop teaching protection protocols. This is not negotiable." The pressure increased, becoming painful. Marcus dropped to his knees, his vision starting to tunnel. But through the pain he heard Coleman's voice in his memory. "When you claim the protection, you have to mean it. You have to really believe you have authority." Marcus lifted his head, looked directly at the being, and spoke with every ounce of conviction he possessed. "In the name of Jesus Christ, who claimed authority over this world through sacrifice and resurrection, I command you to leave. You have no power over me. You have no authority here. I am under covenant protection, and you will respect that boundary." The pressure released instantly. The being stepped back as if struck. The light around them flickered, and Marcus heard that voice again. But this time it sounded strained. "The invocation is valid. The covenant is active. We cannot proceed." "That's right," Marcus said, standing back up on shaking legs. "You can't, because this isn't your world. These aren't your people. And no matter how advanced you are, no matter what technology or power you possess, you're still subject to laws that you didn't write and can't override." The three beings began to fade, but before they disappeared completely, one spoke a final message. "This changes nothing. Your species remains vulnerable. Most do not know the protection exists. Most will not believe when told. We will continue our work. You have only protected a fraction. Then I'll protect that fraction," Marcus replied, "and teach them to protect others. And maybe eventually enough people will wake up that you won't have any more subjects to study." The beings vanished. The lights flickered back on. Marcus stood alone in his garage, surrounded by the familiar smell of oil and metal, but feeling like he'd just fought a battle on a completely different plane of existence. He was shaking, sweating, his head throbbed, but he was alive, unharmed, protected. The confrontation changed something fundamental in Marcus. Before, he'd been sharing what he'd learned because it seemed like the right thing to do. After, it became a mission, a calling. He'd stood face to face with beings that treated humanity as subjects to be studied, and he'd seen their power checked by something greater. Something rooted in events 2,000 years old, but still active, still relevant, still protecting those who knew how to claim it. Word of his encounter spread through the network. Some people were frightened by it, others were emboldened, but everyone understood that what Marcus was teaching wasn't theoretical. It was tested, proven, real. More people came, not just individuals with encounter experiences, but families, communities, church groups that had been quietly dealing with this phenomena but didn't know how to address it. Marcus stopped being just a mechanic with a strange sideline. He became a resource, a teacher, a bridge between ancient spiritual wisdom and modern phenomena. He partnered with Rachel to create written materials, practical guides for people experiencing encounters, how to recognize the signs, how to activate protection, how to maintain spiritual vigilance without living in fear. They distributed these through underground networks, careful to avoid mainstream attention, but getting the information to those who needed it. Pastor Coleman connected him with other clergy who understood this reality, a network of pastors, priests, and spiritual leaders who'd been dealing with these issues in their congregations, but felt isolated by the broader church's refusal to acknowledge the phenomena. Together, they began developing a theology that integrated traditional Christian teaching with the reality of non-human intelligence and cosmic conflict. The work was exhausting. Marcus still had to run his garage, pay his bills, maintain some semblance of normal life, but the purpose sustained him. For the first time since his divorce, since the years of drift and loneliness, he felt like his life had meaning beyond just getting through each day. He saw the impact in people's faces. The woman who'd been experiencing encounters for 20 years and thought she was losing her mind, who wept with relief when she learned she wasn't crazy, that the protection was real, that she could stop living in fear. The man whose daughter had been taken and returned, who learned how to help her process the trauma while claiming spiritual authority over their home. The teenager who'd been marked since childhood, who discovered through Marcus's teaching that she had power, agency, authority that the beings had to respect. These weren't abstract theological discussions. This was practical spiritual warfare, and people were winning battles they'd thought were unwinnable. A year after the Morrison incident, Marcus stood in his garage looking at a map on the wall. Red pins marked locations where people in his network had reported encounters. Blue pins marked where people were implementing the protection protocols successfully. The blue pins were spreading, creating clusters of protected communities. The red pins were becoming less frequent in those areas. "You're making a difference," Rachel said, standing beside him. She'd become his partner in this work, her analytical mind complementing his practical approach. "We are making a difference," Marcus corrected. "This was never about me. It's about waking people up to what's really happening and giving them tools to protect themselves. Have you thought about going public? Really public? Writing a book? Doing interviews?" Marcus shook his head. "The moment we go mainstream, we lose credibility. We become entertainment. Conspiracy theory fodder. The people who need this information won't find it through major media channels. They'll find it the way they have been. Through word of mouth, through underground networks, through desperate searches at 3 in the morning when they're trying to figure out if they're losing their minds." That night, after Rachel left and the garage was quiet, Marcus did something he'd been avoiding. He wrote a letter to Dale Morrison. They'd stayed in touch, but at a distance. Dale and his family had moved on with their lives, processing their experience in private, maintaining the protection but not seeking to become advocates or teachers. In the letter, Marcus thanked him for being the first witness Marcus had seen, for demonstrating that the protection was real, for having the courage to pray when everything in the situation said prayer shouldn't work. Without that night, without seeing what Marcus had seen, none of this would have happened. He never mailed the letter, but writing it clarified something for him. He wasn't trying to save the world. He wasn't trying to defeat these beings or expose some vast conspiracy. He was simply doing what mechanics do, fixing what was broken, and what was broken was the connection between humanity and its spiritual protection. The knowledge that had been forgotten, the power that had been neglected. The work continued. Years passed. Marcus's hair started going grey. His garage became legendary in certain circles, the place where you went not just to fix your car, but to understand why the world was stranger than you'd been told. He never got rich, never became famous outside his small network, but he measured success differently now. Success was the family that learned to protect their home and stopped having encounters. Success was the teenager who discovered she wasn't crazy, wasn't possessed, but was experiencing something real that could be defended against. Success was the veteran who finally understood that what he'd seen during his service wasn't hallucination, but perception of a larger reality. Marcus Webb, mechanic from a small Texas town, had become a warrior in a conflict most people didn't know existed, not with weapons or violence, but with knowledge and faith and the stubborn insistence that humanity deserved to know the truth about the cosmos they inhabited. He never saw the beings again after that confrontation in his garage, but he knew they were still out there, still operating, still conducting their research on those who didn't know how to protect themselves. The work would never be finished, but it would continue, person by person, family by family, community by community. Because Marcus had learned something that night on the highway outside Odessa. watching Dale Morrison stand between his family and forces beyond comprehension. He'd learned that faith wasn't about having all the answers or understanding all the mysteries. It was about knowing where the true power resided, about understanding that humans weren't helpless victims in a cosmic game they didn't understand. They were protected, claimed, marked by a covenant that even beings with advanced technology and vast power had to respect. And when they knew that, really knew it, in their bones, in their souls, they became untouchable. The sky above Texas was endless, filled with stars and mysteries and things that moved between the light, but underneath it, in a small garage that smelled of oil and coffee, a mechanic kept the flame alive, kept teaching the truth, kept reminding anyone who would listen that they weren't alone, weren't defenseless, weren't subject to forces they couldn't resist. They were children of the covenant, protected by a sacrifice made on a hill outside Jerusalem 2 millennia ago, connected to a power that predated the stars and would outlast them, and that changed everything. Perhaps the greatest protection has never been distance from darkness, but the light we carry within, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be claimed. Perhaps the cosmic battle isn't fought with weapons, but with the simple act of knowing who we are and whose we are. Perhaps heaven never needed to descend to earth because it was always here, woven into the fabric of reality itself, accessible to anyone who learned to see it. Truth or fiction? Maybe neither the teller nor the listener truly knows. Here, stories exist to touch hearts and spark reflection. The magic reveals itself only to those willing to feel, not to those who demand certainty.